December 12, 1952. 3:07 a.m. The NRX reactor hall at Chalk River Laboratories, Ontario, erupts with a sound that has no precedent in the history of Canadian industry. A thunderclap, then a roar of steam escaping under pressure, then a fountain of radioactive water from the top of the reactor vessel. Operators in the control room, 200 meters away, see the instruments spike beyond their scales and then freeze. Sirens, never meant to sound in anger, begin to wail. Nobody yet knows if the core is melting into the earth, if the containment has been breached, if the Ottawa Valley is being poisoned. The silence after the alarms is broken by a single question, heard through the closed door. Did we lose the core? This is the story of how a single, inexplicable power surge brought Canada's first atomic reactor to the edge of annihilation, and how the men inside the plant paid for it with their own futures. 16 days before the accident, an inspector signed off on a note that the safety rods did not always reseat fully under certain conditions. That report was filed and soon forgotten. Chalk River, Ontario, 1952. A laboratory carved from pine forest 100 miles northwest of Ottawa, the heart of Canada's fledgling nuclear program. The NRX reactor was the most powerful research reactor on Earth, a showcase of Canadian engineering. On that December night, a team of operators was running a series of experiments, the kind they'd run dozens of times. They wanted to test the reactor's behavior at low power. The machines were new, the training manual had gaps, and the responsibility for a multi-million-dollar atomic pile rested on a handful of men who had no idea that a single misreading would put them at the edge of catastrophe. The signs were there, but the language was one the operators hadn't learned. At 2:50 a.m., the fission product neutron flux began to oscillate, and the pen recorders drew jagged peaks. In the control room, the men compared readings to a chart, but the chart didn't cover this region of operation. The water level in the reactor vessel was falling. Then they noticed the dousing tank supply valve had been closed by mistake earlier in the evening. Perhaps it was that. They didn't realize that the reactor was boiling the coolant in its own core. Meanwhile, a set of interlocks meant to prevent the rods from being withdrawn too fast was not functioning. No one had documented it. The operators trusted the instruments and their own instincts. They had no reason, they thought, to doubt the machine. The decision that sealed the reactor's fate was made by one man. The operator on duty, a technician with years of experience in experimental physics, decided that the reactor's power level was too low for the next phase of the experiment. He could not know that his instrumentation was flawed. He asked Canada's Atomic Agency for clearance to lift the safety rod designated J-rod, a rod that had a history of slow withdrawal and erratic response. At 2:57 a.m. he received authorization. The rod lifted. The reactor went critical almost immediately. But no one in the control room saw the exponential climb on their screens. For a few precious minutes, the core below them was racing toward a point of no return. 30 seconds after the J-rod reached its new position, the NRX experienced an excursion. The power, steady at low megawatts, shot beyond any design limit, perhaps 100-fold, perhaps more. Estimates disagree. The coolant flash evaporated, forming enormous bubbles. Those bubbles lifted the heavy calandria vessel, and in the process, the control rods, their sheaths misaligned, were blocked from dropping. The reactor's own safeguards failed. Then came a hydrogen explosion, generated by the reaction of hot zirconium with water vapor. A shockwave tore through the core, rending fuel rods, knocking the vessel's lid askew. Highly radioactive coolant, laden with fission products, erupted from the wreckage, flooding the hull. Inside the control room, the gauges trembled and went dark. The reactor was no longer a reactor, it was a pile of radioactive rubble. If this story is new to you, subscribe to Nuclear Disasters. There are dozens more the world tried to forget. The first response was undertaken in a state of near total ignorance. A reactor safety team was assembled from the night shift, men without radiation training. Their mission: enter the reactor hall and manually rotate the emergency rods into what was left of the core. They were given heavy rubber overshoes, which they eventually removed, but no dosimeters, no protective masks. They walked into a room where the radiation levels were measured later in thousands of rads. They made their way to the top of the vessel, strained against the stuck rods, and worked in shifts of minutes, only to retreat to the control room, coughing. None of the men were officially recorded as receiving a dose that night. One worker later recalled seeing the blue glow of Cherenkov radiation from the exposed fuel and knowing deep down that something had gone terribly wrong. It took a full day before the scale of the disaster sank in. When the vessel was opened, the core was a blackened ruin, fuel rods bent and shattered. Investigators realized that the explosion had driven radioactive debris through the roof louvers, and that on that night, a steady wind had carried a plume of fission products across the Ottawa Valley. An immediate survey of the area detected contamination on farms and in roadside ditches, but the public was never alerted. Internally, the Atomic Energy of Canada Limited knew the release was in the order of 10,000 Curies, a substantial release, though the official report would later claim it was minor. Several neighboring communities continued to drink their water, unknowingly ingesting low levels of radioiodine. The silence was deliberate. The cover-up had begun. The cleanup of Chalk River became a legend in nuclear history, but its human toll remains unfairly obscure. Hundreds of Canadian workers and U.S. Navy personnel were brought in to dismantle the damaged reactor. They worked in shifts of 45 seconds each, approaching the highly radioactive core with long poles and cutting torches, and then running back to the shielding blocks. A young lieutenant, later to be President of the United States, Jimmy Carter, was among those men. The workers' doses were recorded and supposedly kept below limits, but records show that some received more than 5 rem in the first hour alone. Many went on to suffer cancers, blood disorders, and a lifetime of unexplained symptoms. No official compensation was ever paid, and no one in the chain of command was held accountable. The cost of that reactor was paid by the bodies of the men who ran to it. When the inquiry was finally held, it delivered its verdict with all the weight of a government wishing to move on. It concluded that the accident was caused by a combination of deficiencies in the design of the control rods and the inadequate training of the operators. It recognized the bravery of the crews, but assigned blame to no one individual. The full technical report was classified, and for years the public was told only that a malfunction had occurred. The atomic industry in Canada would continue to flourish. The NRX was rebuilt, restarted, and remained operational for decades. But the pattern of quieting dissent, of burying the truth, had been established. The moral failure of Chalk River was not just an engineering one. It was the decision, made by responsible men, to treat a near disaster as a public relations problem rather than a warning. The legacy of Chalk River is a paradox. In the decades that followed, reactor safety became a rigorous international discipline, with human factors engineering, fail-safe mechanisms, and emergency protocols. The lessons from 1952 saved lives, including at Chernobyl in modified form. Indeed, Soviet engineers studied the Canadian case. But there was also another legacy, a culture of silence that allowed the human victims to be forgotten. It is believed that no comprehensive long-term health study was ever conducted on the cleanup workers. And the site itself, still a major nuclear research center, carries the scars of that night beneath its new buildings. The NRX incident remains a sobering reminder that in a nuclear disaster, the first casualty is always the truth, and the last are the people who gave their health for a scientific future they would not live to see. Subscribe to Nuclear Disasters for more stories the world tried to bury.